Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Good Book Club. It is our March edition. I'm already having trouble speaking. This is not boding well. No, it's March 10th. It's a Sunday morning and it's daylight savings. So we'll see how it goes. We may have some people that pop in right in the middle of it, which is fine. We always start our book club meetings by reading our mission statement, and we're going to have Melissa do that today.
The Good Book Club was created to bring together nuanced Mormons, post-Mormons, and others with a shared interest in Mormonism. We are introspective, critical thinkers seeking to learn, connect, and build relationships through the catalyst of literature. We welcome all who are searching for a safe space to share authentic thoughts, feelings, and ideas through open dialogue and shared experiences relative to Mormon culture. As we deconstruct previous beliefs, we encourage all to find happiness in the process of discovering new religious ideologies, spirituality, and life philosophies.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. I love that. It's always nice to hear that every month to remind ourselves of what we're all about, what we're trying to do. So we'll go through a few brief announcements and then we'll get right to our presentation. The Good Book Club, many people from the Good Book Club were at Thrive St. George last weekend. It was really, really fun. You can see that picture there in the middle. That's kind of the executive team. We took a picture all together. I'd like also to mention, please, everyone, mute your microphones while you're not speaking. Thank you. So that's a picture of the executive team right there in the middle. Also, Landon and Melissa and I kind of inadvertently stumbled on the Red Cliffs Temple, and we were able to go inside for the tour. That was very interesting on a very windy day. And Landon made the joke, he's always dreamed of being able to take two women to the temple, and he did it. So there you go. Go Landon, right? We also went over to the Mountain Meadows Massacre site. Our book club has gone down there twice and read every book there is. And so it was really interesting to tour that again with some other people, some new friends that we had made at Thrive. So that was a fun experience. All right, upcoming events. Here we go. Let's talk about this. Again, I helped John DeLynn run the Mormon Stories Book Club. Uncultured is the book we're working on. We don't have a time quite yet, but grab the book, start reading, start listening, and we'll let you know how you can participate in that live podcast coming up, probably, I'm guessing, in about a month. Another book that I kind of discovered on the radar, it's called American Trinity and Other Stories from the Mormon Corridor. These are actually fiction stories, which we don't read in the Good Book Club, but I thought this looked really interesting. So I'm going to get a hold of David and see if we can do some kind of episode with him. But in the meantime, this looked really interesting. Check it out. Of course, we just did an episode on Mormonish Podcast, episode 134, with the amazing Aaron Stiles on the book Devil Sat on My Bed, Encounters with the Spirit World in Mormon, Utah. Excellent book. Encourage everybody to grab a copy or get it on Kindle and check out that episode. It just came out, 134 with Aaron. Really interesting about the spirit world and Mormonism. Also, Letting Go, Lisa Hosler, our book club member. We are going to podcast with her. I have said this about 300 times, but we absolutely are. And this is an incredible book. If you haven't had a chance to get a copy, grab this, get reading. This is amazing. Letting Go, How a Family Crisis Brought Clarity and Authenticity. Excellent book. And Lisa's amazing too. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is a lecture for those of you that are in the Salt Lake area. This is going to be March 14th. That is Thursday, 3 p.m., University of Utah. It's Jana Reese, and she's going to be talking about some new data on people that are leaving Mormonism. It's very interesting. I've looked through this data, and to me, it's way more accurate than information we've been getting in the past. She's also going to be talking about her next book. Now I can't even think it. The Next Mormon was her first book. You can check that one out. A lot of stats on where Mormonism is going. Her next book is The Next Mormon. Next book, I can say that all together, is going to be more anecdotal story. She's going to be talking about that too. So if anybody's in the area, check it out. I think a few of us from book club are going to try to go March 14th, 3 p.m., University of Utah. Should be good. It will not be Zoomed. I checked into that, so you'd have to go in person. Let's see. Another thing on the radar for people that are in the area, this is something we are so excited about. Mormonish Podcast, Landon and I, and the amazing Rob Lauer have teamed up to put on a reader's theater of the play, The Beehive State. This is a play written by amazing playwright Rob Lauer. He's also the former director of the Hill Cumorah pageant. So this is kind of exciting. It's a play about post-manifesto polygamy. It's witty, wonderful, true, a complex look at post-manifesto polygamy in the early 1900s. This is going to be on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th. That's a Sunday. It's going to follow Thrive Unite. that's another event that if you're in the area, you might consider attending, although it's almost sold out. This is going to be at the location known as the Reserve. It's a reception room in the Provo Town Center down in South Provo. So Thrive Unite all day. Buy a ticket to that by going to Thrive Beyond Religion. This play, the Readers Theater, starts at 6 p.m. in the evening, and there's no charge for that. You don't have to attend Thrive to be able to come to this. So this is going to be incredible. Just come in, enjoy this play. It's going to be wonderful.
And we will be recording that and
Yes.
putting it out, but it will not be live recorded.
Exactly. You can attend it live, or we'll give you information on how to watch the recorded episode. We'll throw it up on Mormonish. So, but just so good. So good. We put this together. We found actors with the help of the amazing director, Monique Durr, and it's really, really good. You're going to want to somehow access this, whether in person or watching the episode after the fact. All right. Next month, our book is The Amazing Guns, Germs, and Steel. I swear this has been on our list for like 5 years, but we're finally getting to it, and Bruce is going to be leading it. He will give us a little preview at the end of our discussion today. And I think that leads us to our book today, Devil's Gate, and our presentation. We're so lucky. Landon is taking this book, and this is going to be wonderful. Take it away, Landon.
Okay. For those who haven't read Guns, Germs, and Steel, it is a fascinating book. It's a little bit of a hard read because it is a very scientific, but it's well worth the read. You'll learn so much about pre-Columbian America and how things came about. It's really a fascinating book. So, can you guys see my screen? Is it showing?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So today we are talking about Devil's Gate, Brigham Young and the Great Handcart Tragedy. This is a book that has been on our radar that we wanted to read because of the fact that it so often in church history we don't ever get the full story of what we hear throughout our lives in the church, and so this is one. Nobody can be a Mormon and not know about the Mormon handcart pioneers. And it's interesting to note that the handcart pioneers was a very small piece of the immigration here to Utah. The numbers I was looking at said there was about 59,000 pioneer immigrants that came to the Utah Valley now, or the Salt Lake Valley. Now, we all know how the church likes to play numbers, so was it really 59,000 or not is sometimes questionable. But of those that came in handcarts, it was only about 3,000. So we do all of this, all of these treks and all of these things that we do and commemorate the handcart pioneers, and yet they were a very, very small portion of the pioneers that came over. So why is it that we talk about the handcart pioneers so much? And that's what this book kind of points out and brings out, is it brings out the true story of the handcart company and how it's not a triumph, or it wasn't a triumph, but it has been turned into a triumph, kind of in a PR blitz by the church to protect Brigham Young, or at least that's what the author's contention is. So as we go through the book today, we want to discuss some of those items and some of the things that we learned, some of the things that aren't in the official narrative, are all things that we want to discuss as part of this book today. So this one's a little bit different from a lot of the books we read. You know, they have concepts or themes that we discuss or that we like to go and study. In this case, it's basically a narrative of what happened in a historical record. So what I want to do is I want to start and kind of walk through the trek as it happened, and then we'll stop and talk about it and get people's feelings on it, because there's probably many of you who came from pioneer stock that have handcart people who came across the plains in your background. So it's always fun to hear those stories and hear your thoughts. And also maybe how did the book change how you thought about your ancestors and their trip across, or you know, were they duped? Were they faithful? Were they people who had just such an overwhelming love of the gospel that they were willing to do whatever it took to get here? And so to start out with, I want to start out with Bring Them to Zion. The first part is, you know, why did so many handcart pioneers come here? Or why was there this need to have all of these pioneers? And really, most of the handcart companies, most of the pioneers themselves came from the UK, David's neck of the wood there across the pond. And so they did come from other places. We know there were Italians, there were Danes, there were, I think, Swedes. They did come from all over Europe, but the vast majority of them came from the UK, and definitely the Willey Martin handcart companies, a majority of them came from the UK. They talked about a group that came from Wales, some from Scotland, but most from the English area. And that all is a result of the church. In 1852, 53, they started sending a lot of missionaries over to the UK to start growing the church there. And it was really quite successful, as we all know. And I think the success came kind of because of the result of many factors. The first of which is we're in the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of poor people over in the UK. They're living in squalor. They're living in poor conditions. And here is the new world, America, with wide open land, wide open opportunities. It's its ability to escape the UK and come and start a new life in the Americas. And so many people were willing to come and do that. And obviously, the religious fervor of the time, people were looking for a second coming. They were looking, and the church really brought a lot of ideas that I think sold to them. You know, this new Jerusalem, we're forming a new Jerusalem. We're going to prepare for the second coming of the Savior. It's close. But as Brigham Young is sitting over in Salt Lake, he needs a couple things. He needs one, they're poor. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have any industry, and he needs a workforce. And Britain provides just such that workforce. The other thing is it's hard to control, especially a high demand religion, or some people might even say a cult, from thousands of miles away, with people who are living in a country where they're not the predominant religion. And I think Brigham Young saw that he needed to get these people to America, to Salt Lake, where they were where they were in a closed society. They only had the church to take care of them. And for people coming from Europe, you got to think that the church provides a great opportunity. If you're in Europe and you're trying to figure out, how do I get to the Americas? How do I get an opportunity? They provided that for you. They're going to put a ship together. You're going to get on the ship. They're going to get you to America. Then you're going to get on a train. You're going to go. They're walking you right through to get you to Salt Lake. And so it's the easy button. This is an easy way to get into the new world. And all you got to do is join the church. The problem is just like almost in all times, they weren't getting the rich people that were joining the church, or even the middle class. This was really the poor people who were joining the church over in England, and who were coming over. And so they basically said that, hey, Jesus is coming again, and only those who are in Zion are really going to be saved. And so everyone needs to come to Zion. And there was the big call to come to Zion. We all know the hymn, "Come to Zion, come to Zion." So those all kind of came from that time period. And so there's a big move to get them on. The man here in the picture, his name is Franklin Richards. He's, I think, Willard Richards, and one other apostle came from him. He's an apostle. He was the mission president of the England mission. And so he was sent over to gather the saints, to get them and to send them on to the Americas. And he plays a very important role in this story, because we're going to find him showing up all throughout the story as he comes back to the U.S. and is also on the trail at the same time as the Willey Martin Handcart Company. Now, it's important to know that when the people left England, and those that read the book, you'll see that they didn't know, or at least majority of them had no idea about this handcart idea. They came across thinking that they were going to come to New York, or Boston and work for a year or two, save up the money to get a rig, wagon, and then come across the plains several years later after they've got there. They show up in New York, and all of a sudden they're told you need to hop on a train and get to Iowa City, where you're going to pull handcarts across across the plains. Which, from a lot of the stories in the book, that was something that they did not take well to. There were several complaints. What are we, pack animals, that we're going to pull all of this across? And what really surprised me, and what was interesting to me, was how many of these trains were women, children, older people. A lot of these people were 50s, 60-year-olds. Talked about one guy who had a peg leg, and he was going to pull a handcart across the plains with a peg leg, and just stories like that. And you got to imagine what those people were thinking. But as I sat back and thought about the story, I was like, well, what is this that? What option do they have once they've left England? They've bought the passage. They've made this ocean voyage of several months. They're here in a new land. They have nowhere to go. They have no way to get there. They really had very few options here except to go on and to get to Zion. That was their best hope. That was where they had connections, and that's where many of them went. And I say many of them because one of the things the book does point out is that a lot of people would get here. They'd get to New York and Boston, and then they just fade away and never to be heard from or see the church again. There were the ones that they called the turnbacks that as they got started on the trail, they realized this is not for me, and they either turned around and went back to Iowa City, or they went back to winter quarters. And so there were a lot of these people who, once they got here and saw what they'd gotten themselves into, they did turn around and try to make a new life where they were. In most cases, I found very little stories of where the people actually went all the way back to England after getting there. So we want to talk, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is the Mormon Trail. What is the Mormon Trail? How far is it? And what they have to do. So I've got this map here, and one of the things, I don't know if you can see my pointer. Can you guys see my pointer? At the time, the trains, they did have trains when they came, but the train went as far as Iowa City, which Iowa City sits right about here. Once they got trained into Iowa City, and Iowa City had two options. They'd either ride a train in, or they'd come up the Mississippi River on a steamboat and get off near Iowa City. And then from that point, they had to make their way across to Utah. So Iowa City was the first gathering point. That's the first place that the Saints would start. This is where they had to get their handcarts, because now obviously there's no train. They have to get a way to get across. And so Iowa City is where they started building the handcarts. And in every case, and when we talk about the Willey and Martin Handcart Company, they were the fourth and the fifth handcart companies. There was three other handcart companies that went in the same year of 1856. Every single handcart company started in Iowa City, and we'll talk about how the problems they ran into there. And then from Iowa City, they'd cross Iowa over to Council Bluffs, and you see Council Bluff there. Winter Quarters is what it's called, and Winter Quarters is kind of the last outpost before they would head out into the plains and head across to Utah. So that was really their last place to back out. And Winter Quarters is what's in current day Florence. It was also called Florence back then, but that's where they would leave from. Winter Quarters is where Brigham Young left from. And so Brigham Young and the first group of Saints, their trek was about just over 1,000 miles from Winter Quarters into Salt Lake City. Iowa City added about another 300 miles onto that trip, making the total trip 1,300 miles from when you got off the train till when you got to Salt Lake City. And as anyone look at this map, there were a couple places where they could stop and get supplies. That was Fort Kearny in Nebraska. I believe Fort Kearny was more of a military post. And the other one was Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was a civilian post that soldiers would come to, cavalry would come in and out of it, but it was more of a private industry. And although you could buy goods there, they were extremely high priced. As you can imagine, everything had to get brought out there, so they charge you the cost to transport things to get out there. And then from Fort Laramie, you had to go pretty much to Fort Bridger, which is close to the Utah border. And then Fort Bridger, you could restock and get supplies, and then you drop down into Utah. Along this trail, though, you had to cross the Rocky Mountains, and that was a difficult endeavor. And the Rocky Mountains was the most difficult part of the crossing. And what you see there is there were several points along the route that they would look to. Chimney Rock was one of them, Independence Rock. South Pass was another one. At the time, South Pass is kind of the lowest area where you can cross and that you can take wagons through the Rocky Mountains. As you can imagine, it's steep, but South Pass, they'd found a way that you could get through. The concern obviously was that you did not want to get caught in the Rocky Mountains in the wintertime or in the fall. And that was always so the rule was that you wanted to start out early in the season and get through that in the summertime. You did not want to get caught there in the fall and in the wintertime, especially. One thing that I did not know that I really learned on this book in a trip, Tom and we went out to these sites last September, and I've got some pictures that we're going to show of that. And I didn't realize, the first thing when you spend a little bit of time in Wyoming that you learn is the wind never stops blowing and it's always cold. I've been through South Pass, I think 3 or 4 times, and it has always been cold when I've been there. South Pass currently has an old ghost town. It's a really neat historical site. We really enjoyed South Pass. However, at the time that the handcart pioneers went through there was no town there, and it was one of the more difficult passes. So as we get in the story, I just wanted to kind of lay this out. But the important thing to remember is, I think growing up, I always pictured that the pioneers crossed the plains and it was this really hard experience that you were risking your life to get to Utah, and that once you got to Utah, you were in Utah. You didn't leave. You made it, and you just stayed in Zion. But that's not the case at all. This trail here that you're seeing was a highway. It was a highway of the time. The Oregon Trail followed this route. The Mormon Trail followed this route. There were people on this trail all the time. The original pioneers came across in 1847, as we all know, the first group. By the time the handcart companies came across, the Mormons had crossed so many companies across the plains. They knew what they were doing. They knew what to expect. They knew the route. They knew the dangers. They knew when it would snow. They knew what the chances are that it would snow. Brigham Young himself had crossed the plains, I think, twice by this time. He had William Clayton, his scribe, had crossed 17 times. He'd crossed the plains during this time. They were sending missionaries back to Europe. They were sending them off to Asia. They knew what it took to get across the plains. And so that plays a lot into the story here because, sometimes it's easy to say, well, how could they have known that, or how could they have expected that or accounted for that? They could, because people were going back and forth all the time. And one of the things you read about is they're all passing each other, and they know each other, and they're talking to each other, and they're sharing information with each other. And so there was mail going back and forth. So this was a popular route. And so that's important to know. When we talk about the first Mormon company that went out, I want to compare the first Mormon company that went out with the handcart companies that went out. Brigham Young, this is the Vanguard company that went out in 1847, that left from Council Bluffs. It departed on April 16th, 1847. So they left very early in the spring. They departed from Winter Quarter, so they departed 300 miles more west than what the handcart companies did. They arrived in the valley on July 21st, so it took them 100 days to cross from Winter Quarters. But they took wagons. They did not take handcarts. And just to give you an idea of what the composition looked like, the composition of the first one that Brigham Young went on was 142 men, 3 women, and 2 children. The women weren't even supposed to go. One of the guys got sick and dropped out, and Brigham Young brought a wife, a couple of wives, and their children with them. It was really made up of all men. It was more of a scouting party. As soon as they got there, the job was to start setting up the settlement. And then a lot of them, most of them, turned around and went back and then came out again the next year to start the settlement. But with them, they took 72 wagons, 93 horses, 52 mules, 66 oxen, 19 cows, 17 dogs, and some chickens. Mules were the best animals you could have. They were like a horse, but they were more sturdy and more durable and could go fast. The horses were good for carrying people, for scouting, getting out, hunting. If you're trying to hunt buffalo on the plain and stuff, having a horse is very useful. Running after buffalo and trying to kill them is a lot less effective than chasing them down on horse. Oxen were really good for pulling, but they were also very slow. They could go about 3 miles a day with an oxen pulling the thing. So it was very slow going if you had the oxen pulling the carts. I looked, I could not find any deaths happening in this original scene. So that tells you that even though we all growing up Mormon heard about how bad and how they were risking their lives to cross the plains, it was really fairly safe. I looked at some of the numbers of the companies that came across, and really most of them, some of them actually had negative deaths. No, they weren't resurrecting people along the way. They were having babies along the way, and so they'd actually end up with more people than they left with when they got to the other end. There were 2 things that really hurt the companies. One, the handcart companies, the Willey and Martin lost so many people that was a big death toll, and that plays into this death experience that we hear about all the time. The other one was disease. 2 of the wagon trains coming across left with cholera that they didn't know they had. And as they got out on the plains, the cholera took over. And those ones actually killed more people than died in the Willey and Martin Handcart Company. The trains that had cholera lost about 20% of the people. The other thing that would take you out is Rocky Mountain fever, which I think was like a measles or something like that. But a lot of people died from that disease as well. So disease was more likely the case that was going to kill you than was Indians. In fact, Indians was a very, the Plains Indians, you always hear that they were scared of them. And yet a lot of times you hear more stories of where the Indians saved the settlers or helped the settlers than where they actually attacked or hurt the settlers. So that's an interesting thing, because I always thought that was one of the things they would have to face on the trail. And really, that was an insignificant part. Just to put this in motion, this was the wagon train packing list for anyone coming across in a wagon. You can see there you were supposed to bring 2 or 3 good yoke of oxen, 2 milk cows, another cow for beef, 3 sheep, 1,000 pounds of flour, 1 good musket or rifle, 1 pound of powder, 4 pounds of lead, apples, salt, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamons, soap, 20 pounds of soap. Evidently you got dirty crossing. 15 pounds of iron and steel, nails, fishing nets, pulley blocks to get you up, cooking utensils, pots, tin plates, knives, good tent. these wagons would go out with 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of goods on them, which is one of the reasons they needed the oxen to help pull. And as you saw with Brigham Young, you had 72 wagons of this kind pulling across there. So they were bringing seeds, they were bringing tools, they were bringing everything they needed to get a start in the new country. So how did that change? Well, let's talk about the plan. The problem here was that to outfit a wagon with 3,000 pounds of goods, the oxen and everything that it said, it costs about $93 a person to bring a saint across the plains. And these were the poor saints. And so they couldn't, Brigham Young said, I need a plan that will get the saints here a lot less expensive than what we're spending. When you figure a family of 5, that's like $500 a person, which was a huge amount. They'd have to work 2 to 3 years to save that much money to get a wagon to bring the families across. So one day he's sitting out in the Beehive House, surrounded by his many women, I guess, and he's watching, looking at the street, and this prospector comes walking down the street with a wagon, and he's heading to the California gold fields, and he's got everything he's going to take. He's got it in his wheelbarrow, and he's pushing it across the plains. And Brigham Young says, "Well, if they can do it, why can't we do this?" So he comes up with this plan. The plan kind of has 2 pieces to it. The first one is he wants to set up a perpetual education fund. And the intent of this fund is that you donate money, the poor people coming from England can take a loan, and from this loan, they will help them get over here. That solves a couple of Brigham Young's problems. He needs labor. He wants converts for his church. It gives him money because these people are going to pay it back at 10% interest. So he's financing it. They're going to buy land from him, or they're going to farm land, or whatever. And one of the ways they could pay back the loan in many different ways, they could do it through labor. They could do it through actual paying off loans, the loan with money. So there were different ways. So it was really quite an ingenious idea. Who else out there was funding or financing people coming to the New World?
Yeah,
this is one of the big attractions to Mormonism, is that they're financing their crossing and they're coming over.
Wasn't it the Perpetual Immigration Fund?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that should be Immigration Fund. Yeah.
There were so many funds. How can we keep track?
The new play on it is nowadays Education Fund, but Perpetual Immigration Fund.
You're correct. Yeah, it should be Immigration Fund. I'm sorry, and I have that in, I'm going to it next. I just typed that in wrong. So I'm used to getting asked for the Perpetual Education Fund, although they're probably still taking donations to the Immigration Fund. I don't think they turned those down. But his idea then was that, from the wheelbarrow, was, what if we built these hand carts that would be light, they'd be fast, they'd be able to cross the plains, and in his terms, 63 days, 65 days that they could get across the plains. They'd be able to come fast, so they wouldn't have to bring as much equipment with them. And there's already people in the valley that can sell them stuff when they get here, so they don't have to bring everything with them. We can now sell them their clothes and their everything they need once they get here. So this idea to do these hand carts reduced the cost from $93 a person to $13 a person. So this plan was all about saving money and making it possible to get the poor people over there. Now, I don't think that's a bad idea, that you got to find a way to get the poor people here to reduce cost. In my business, we do contracting, and we build things and stuff. And we always say, you can have it good, you can have it fast, or you can have it cheap. Pick any 2 of the 3. Well, I think when you're crossing the plains, you could have it safe, you could have it cheap, or you could have it fast, and you have to pick 2 of the 3. So if you're going to come fast and you're going to come cheap, you got to give up on safety, because coming fast and cheap means you're not bringing a lot of stuff with you, which means that you run a chance of running out of food. You run a chance of getting caught in a storm, and it's just a matter of time before you're going to get caught in that. And so, to me, this is the fatal flaw of the plan. Was, cheap and fast sounds great, but eventually people are going to get hurt when they're trying to do that. And so there are things he could have done to offset it. In the first three, they did some of that. They sent out supply wagons to meet them partway through and resupply them. On the last two of 1856, that did not happen, and that's where you run into the problem. You're trying to move fast, you're trying to move cheap, and when you're moving people fast, the information doesn't necessarily get there on time, and you're not able to react in time to stave off some of these. And that to me was the fatal part of the plan. So, and I'm going to open this to questions here in just a few minutes, but I do want to go over the Perpetual Immigration Fund, because this really did for immigration what financing did for the automobile industry. People couldn't afford cars. We can't afford houses without financing. And Brigham Young kind of figured that out, that if he financed people, then they would come across, and a lot more people would come. And that's one of the reasons I believe that there's so many people joined the church, was to take advantage of this. So I want to read this because it's important to understand this and to understand how the Perpetual Immigration Fund works. The PEF used a combination of church resources and private contributions to provide initial aid for impoverished church members as they moved west. The ordinance incorporating the PEF set aside Antelope Island and Stansbury Island, 2 islands in the Great Salt Lake, for the company's exclusive use. On Antelope Island, the church operated a ranch with tithing herds of cattle and sheep in order to generate revenue for the fund. Anyone who's been out to the Gar Ranch, it's just a couple miles from my house, on Antelope Island, that was the purpose, was to raise money for the Perpetual Immigration Fund. The aid provided to immigrants was structured in the form of loans, with the design of constantly replenishing the fund by having these members repay the assistance once established in the new homes. Recipients would sign a promissory note to reimburse the company for their costs, and were often permitted to satisfy their obligation with commodities or labor in addition to cash. Over the life of the program, nearly 30,000 individuals received assistance, primarily with travel arrangements and outfitting. As the funding was never able to support all who might need assistance, priority was given to long-standing church members and those with useful skills needed in the Western frontier environment. This sounds a little bit to me like BYU. BYU's funded by tithing. But all members who pay tithing don't get into BYU. They select who gets into BYU. And it was kind of that way with the Perpetual Immigration Fund. If you were a longstanding member, you got a loan. If you had a skill that the church needed or that the community needed, you got a loan. Otherwise, you were on your own. While proselyting efforts in Europe led to increasing numbers of new converts drawing on the PEF, the company only sometimes paid for a recipient ship passage. More often, it assisted with overland travel costs for those already residing or newly arrived in the U.S. In the Utah economy, availability of cash remained a limiting factor. For members seeking to emigrate from Great Britain, Church Mission President Samuel Richards instituted a plan that this one was very interesting. He instituted a plan that the immigrants would pool their existing, if meager, resources into the PEF, then pay back the full amount of assistance, regardless of whether they had also donated. So what the church would do is they'd say, give us all of your money, we're all going to pool it, and then once we have this pool of money, we're going to give you a loan so that you can get over to the Americas, but you have to pay back that loan at 10% interest, even though you're the one who donated the money into the fund. So you're borrowing against the money you put into the fund and paying it back to the church. So that is really quite I don't know who would agree to this, but in the book, it talked about several well-to-do members who actually donated everything they had to the church and then took a loan out and came across as paupers and then spent the next 20 years paying back the loan to the church that they owed as a result. It says, as not all could accommodate at once, this would help the earlier group of immigrants support those coming after. And then it says, because it was in Britain, majority of the people coming across using that were from Britain. So last thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the handcarts and what they would bring, and then I want to stop and get everyone's thoughts about the crossing and what their thoughts were about from the book of reading what happened in England and some of the things that the people had to do to get here. But this is a typical handcart. This is the kind of handcart that the Willey and Martin Handcart Company would have brought. Anyone who's been on trek, what you took on trek is not what they were pulling. They were much smaller than what you take on a trek. They had no metal parts, no ball bearings in the wheels. They didn't have metal shod rims like you see at all the ones that you go to when you stop at the church historical sites. In fact, you see that they're wrapped with rawhide. They would wrap the wheels with rawhide, buffalo skin, cow skin, whatever, to make the wheels. This actually came in very handy because they ended up eating the rawhide off of their wheels when they became so hungry. They'd boil that rawhide and eat it. The Willey and Martin companies did. The others didn't have to resort to that. But you see that it had wood spokes, wood hubs. Everything was made out of wood. That's why green wood is a problem. They're also much smaller. About the maximum weight they could carry would be about 500 pounds total that you could pull in one of these wagons, and they were constantly breaking down. Compare the handcart packing list to the wagon packing list. You were allowed 17 pounds of baggage, clothes, bedding, cooking utensils, etc., period. Each adult got 17 pounds. Each child got 10 pounds. They would shake you down. They would weigh you. They would make sure that you were bringing only 17 pounds. People tried, this was kind of the jet blue of the day. Everyone tried to wear multiple layers of clothes so they didn't get counted on their weight. And then they take it off and put it in the cart afterwards. And they started catching on that that's what they were doing. And then they weighed them on the trail and made them burn the stuff that was overweight and throw it away. They also took with them 1 pound of flour per person per day. 1 pound of flour is equivalent to 2 cups. So you got 2 cups of flour was your meal. That was about 1,200 calories that you were bringing. Anyone who knows anything, of course, calories weren't known back then, but they knew how much food it would take to get people across. 1,200 calories is nowhere near enough to sustain a person doing this kind of work. Typically, you would need about 4,000 calories a day to do this kind of labor. When you get into cold weather and you're losing body heat and stuff, you'd need even more than that. So this was very meager. The church had to have known there was no way that you could get across with that little amount of food. They learned that on the first 3 handcart companies because they had to go restock them 300 miles out in order to get them through because they had lost so much because they had run out of food. Part of the plan was that they'd hunt as they came across, hunt buffalo and other things. These are factory workers from England. They didn't know how to hunt. They couldn't shoot anything. They're on foot. They can't chase anything down. Finding food on the plains was very difficult and didn't happen very often. In addition to the handcart companies, in addition to the handcarts, the companies would take about 8 wagons. They'd have anywhere from 4 to 8 wagons. And the wagons would take the cooking pots. The wagons would also carry a lot of the food was on the wagons. And the wagons also carried the tents that they would sleep in. They had the tents, they'd sleep 20 people in a tent. And so the wagons would bring the tents along and they'd pull up and then everyone would set up a tent and stay the night in the tent intent, I guess you could say. The intent was to be in a tent. So anyway, that's kind of the plan. That's kind of the handcart experience. Just to give you an idea and compare this to the 1847 troop, these guys left July 15th, 1856 from Iowa City. So they were leaving Iowa City almost the same time in the year that the Saints arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. So very late. And by the time they got to winter quarters, it was late in August when they finally got there. They did not arrive in the valley until November 9th, 1856. Remember, they said they could get across in 65 days, and they planned enough food for about 65, 70 days to cross. It took them 118 days to get across. So that's a big food problem right there. When you're short food that much, you have to start rationing. The composition of that, I had no idea that the Willey and Martin Handcart Company was this big. Before that, the other trains that came across had about 150 to 200 people in them. The Willey and the Martin were by far the two largest companies to come across that year. The church says they didn't know they were coming. We know they have a letter that said they were coming. There's no way they didn't know this many people was coming. This is a huge amount of immigrants that were there. The Willey Handcart, 500 individuals, 100 handcarts, and they had 5 wagons to bring all of their supplies with them. The Willey Handcart Company ended up with 67 deaths. The Martin Handcart Company departed on 28 July 1856 from Iowa City. Took them 126 days to make the crossing. They had 575 people, 145 handcarts, and 8 wagons. They ended up with 150 deaths. They had a lot more deaths because one thing that you didn't hear about, if you get a chance, type in handcart images in Yahoo and go in and look at the pictures of the handcart companies. And there's one thing that you notice all the time, and that is there's families pulling handcarts. There's a dad, there's a mom, there's kids, there's usually multiple men. That simply was not the case. 3/4 of the Martin Handcart Company was women. And they were a much older group than all the other handcart companies. One of the guys, as we said, had a peg leg and was supposed to be pulling. So you had whole families. We read of the one family that had 5 daughters. It was all girls pulling the handcarts. The deaths ended up being more men than women. The reason for that, when you read about them, they just kind of collapse in a lot of cases. They just drop dead from exhaustion. The men had an extra duty in addition to pulling the handcarts and setting up the tents, and that is they had to stand guard because of wolves and Indians. They had to stand guard every night. Well, every other night you had to pull a 6-hour shift of guard duty. So you can imagine you just pulled 20, 30 miles, you set up, it's cold, and now you have to stand around guarding the wagons for 6 hours at night. You're going to get a couple hours of sleep, and then you got to do it all again the next day. And this goes on for month after month after month of 6 hours not getting sleep every other day. Okay, so at this point, I want to kind of open it up. What was everybody's thoughts about the handcarts, about the plans, about the crossing, and the people in Europe? Bruce.
Yeah, this kind of hit home with me because my great-grandparents, now not great-great-great-grandparents, just my great-grandparents, my father's grandparents, joined the church in Denmark. They weren't married. He took a passport from a friend who had died. I think there was a war in Denmark at the time, and he was in the military. They got out, were married on the boat across. I have no idea where they ended up, but when they got to where the handcarts started, he hired himself out to drive a wagon for an older couple and got the money to have his wife pull the handcart. The women in my family say, well, that's a typical Christensen move where he rides in a wagon and makes his wife pull the handcart. She pulled the handcart along with another woman named Louisa Euler. And after these two women pulled the handcart across the country, his wife made him marry Louisa, who she'd pulled the handcart with. And so he was a polygamist, but the second wife died in childbirth. So there's no family from that. And he never remarried. But yeah, the whole thing about women doing this, that was my great grandmother's situation. She and another woman had to pull a handcart while he went with another company driving a wagon.
Okay. Other thoughts on the crossing? Or I wanted to kind of hear David's take from the UK on you know, the mission and that kind of stuff. Rebecca.
Okay. I'm on a different computer trying to unmute. I just remember always hearing on Pioneer Day the stories of all the deaths. And then I started to research and realize it was all from, you know, the Willey Martin handcart. And I just, my whole life have been really angry about this whole scenario. Just sort of the lack of concern for life as far as throwing these people out here, just as we'll talk about later, the step by step, the things that happened. They were just basically thrown to literally almost the wolves. And through sheer determination, you know, luck and just the human spirit, most of them were able to make it. And then at that point, for the next centuries or so, the church turned it into this incredible triumph for the church. So they used that after the fact, if that makes sense. And it had nothing to do with the church. The reason these people were able to survive, in fact, it was in spite of the church. So I've always been really upset by that. It's kind of along the same thing as Mountain Meadows, how I just really take this to heart. But again, the thing I celebrate is this human spirit. They did it against all odds and everything working against them, including the church in every part of it, the prep, the journey, the rescue, and then just infuriated by how now the church turns that into an amazing miracle. And we'll talk about that later, but those are just some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I want to say one thing on what you just said there. You know, you said that they made it there in spite of the church. I maybe take a little bit of pause with that, because they needed the church to make this happen, because in many cases they were saved by the church, but the church is the one that put them in the position in the first place. Oregon Trail, the people were making it across on the Oregon Trail to Oregon without rescue parties coming out from some church to save them. But that was because they were going prepared. They were going knowing what they needed to take. They would go in large groups. And with the wagon trains, it was fairly safe to make the crossing. When you got to handcarts, though, you were absolutely reliant on the church. And so it's kind of a foreshadowing of what the church does in spiritual needs. They create a need for them to step in and save you. And that's what they did. And then you saw that when they'd get saved, they'd all go, "Oh, we were saved by the Lord." Well, the Lord's the one that put you in that situation because you went out not prepared because they told you it would be all right. So, David.
This is probably, regardless of the distress that church leaders put these people through, must have been one of the most audacious extensions of faith that I think any religious groups have had. That being said, the context to this is you had Franklin D. Richards in Liverpool as the mission president of the British mission, somewhat claiming or boasting that he could send 10,000 through in the season. In letters, he was in a bitter dispute with John Taylor. And this is evidenced by a 4th of March, 1856 letter from John Taylor to Franklin D. Richards. And in that letter, he says, "In a late communication from you, I'm informed that a wild spirit which I informed you of among the passengers of the Emerald Isle might be attributed to counsel received from the presidency in England to press westward as they can." He then goes on to say that, "Now, Brother Richards, this may all be very courteous, but I'm at a loss to reconcile with your expressed views. You further inform me in your letter that if you do not think I'm proper to resign, I shall find Elders Grant and Kimball very efficient in assisting me with emigration." So that's a snippet from the Brigham Young letter book. But it's showing you that there were tensions between the leadership. I think Patty Loader, or Patience Loader, summed it up well, saying that she was not expecting to pull by handcart, that they thought it was going to be wagons. And the fact that they were paying into these funds in Liverpool and they weren't fully told of the issue. Nevertheless, John Taylor, when these people arrived, were trying to find alternate employment for them to either wait for a season. And yet it was Franklin D. Richards who kept saying, go as west as you can, keep going, keep going. That's what the Lord wants. So they set these pioneers, and they were pioneers, and these emigrants or immigrants up to be in conflict, because as soon as they arrived there, John Taylor, who had taken over the responsibility from the recently deceased Orson Spencer, was saying, no, you need to wait. But they were saying, no, the Lord has commanded us to go westward. How could they then be, led openly, but with such a great belief that they were doing what the Lord had told them, because that's what the mission president had told them, contrary to what John Taylor, one of the senior apostles, had said. So for me, this is, I've gone through this many years, well rehearsed through it, many of the records coming through. I have egregious thoughts of these people, their lack of practicality in going for what they considered an ideal. And yet these people, who were some of the poorest, some of the most vulnerable, they suffered, but still they believed, many to their detriment. And I think just finally, the fact that we hear many of these faith promoting accounts, most of them hadn't even occurred or had been written until about 1914 in the improvement era. And we'll no doubt talk about that later. But they were still being peddled as a faith promoting account, even to the 2006 October General Conference of Gordon B. Hinckley, who quotes about those three great men, and by that very act alone, that that they would receive salvation. I think is disingenuous and dishonest to many of those who gave their lives or their lives were taken. And with that, I will hand back. Thank you, Landon.
Yeah, appreciate that, David. You have a lot of good insight. And just to clarify for those who may not have read the book or didn't catch it, Franklin Richards was the mission president in England. He was an apostle. He did come back with at some point during when they're all coming back. John Taylor was the mission president of the Eastern States Mission. His job would be, he was in New York when the immigrants would come in. He'd get them set up and then get them going on to the rest of the way to Iowa City. And so that was the role John Taylor played. John Taylor and Brigham Young did not get along at all. And I wasn't aware that John Taylor and Richards had issues. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of politics in this. So Luann.
A couple tidbits I learned as I was doing my deconstruction, and I unfortunately don't have references, and I haven't read the book, so I don't know if they were in it. One was that the first trains, handcart trains that went through, some of the fathers of the groups would die from starvation because of not enough food and the amount of labor. And then when they got into the valley to rescue those orphaned or children, they would be put in plural marriage. And some of them were as young as 11 when they came into the valley, and to rescue them, they had to marry someone. And another thing was when Johnson's army came, those very bad, frightening people helped a handcart company that was traveling at the same time by giving them some oxen to eat. Just interesting things.
Yeah, you brought up some good points, because I thought also, as I was reading there, they'd say when the handcart companies would come in, all the Salt Lake came out and would go, hurrah, hurrah, as they came in town. I was wondering how much of that was the men there checking out, okay, who are the new women in town as they streamed by, because a lot of them did get put into the polygamous marriages. In fact, there was the one story about the guy who made it all the way to Salt Lake, and just outside Salt Lake, woman convinced his wife to go live with them. And he went all the way across the plains and lost his wife going into Salt Lake City to a polygamous marriage. So kind of interesting. And the other thing is Johnson's Army. I did not mention that. Johnson's Army was 57 as well. This is all at that same time. One of the reasons they needed immigrants as well is, they're trying to push back to the government about and fight with the government, and they needed people. The more bodies they had, the stronger they looked. So that was another important part of the immigration was to offset that. Rochelle.
Learning about the Perpetual Immigration Fund was really insightful to me, because I think it put together some pieces for me about why so many people converted. And it may not be the only reason, but even if you didn't really believe in the church, it was such an easy way to come to a new land. So here you are, you feel completely like an underdog, you have no way to make your life better in the country that you're in. And then somebody's saying, here's some free money, join our church and we'll bring you to this new land, the land of opportunity, where the streets are lined with gold. And so you have all these people that come here on that promise, and they probably have no idea what Utah actually looks like, but they're like, okay, we're going to be part of this group. And, they go on the train, and then they get their hand carts or their wagons, depending on which group they're in, and they end up in Utah. And I just think that must have been the biggest dupe in the world, because you think you're going to this place where there's opportunity, and here you are stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get out. And then I think it's in the Fanny Stenhouse book, we learned that for some of these people, it's nearly impossible to pay back the loan that you took. Like Brigham Young, if you made any money from Brigham Young, he would basically tell you just, credit that to your tithing. And so for some of these people, they could never pay back these loans. So they were forever indentured servants to the church. And so it was just really insightful for me to learn about that and to better understand why some of these people ended up just kind of trapped in this system that they couldn't get out of.
Yeah, and that was a great point. That was one of the things in the book I didn't realize was they were still paying in like 1880. People from the Willey and Martin Handcart Company were still paying off their loans 30 years later. And they can't leave Utah as long as they own that, because the church would repossess all their possessions until they paid back the loan. So they were really stuck where they were at. So Melanie, I know you've got family that came across in the cart. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I am a fifth generation of the Joseph and Ann Beswick that were in the Martin Handcart Company. And I didn't learn that, I had these people until I was in my 30s. It really wasn't talked about at all in my family. And so I love history and I love genealogy. And so I just decided to, take a deep dive and try to find out as much as I could about what had happened. And if there was anything written about my ancestors or, their trials, there was no journals that our family has of what they wrote down. And one of the things that I just want to make this really short, because you don't want to listen to my whole story, but I thought so much about their trip across the ocean and how that must have just been a horrific thing just in itself to come across. My ancestor who died on the trail was Ann Beswick, and she was 63 years old. So you're right, Landon, there were a lot of, nowadays 63 doesn't sound old, but back then, because of, the way disease and everything else, that was old to travel and to even make it across the ocean. And then to be hurried along, from Boston over to Iowa City is how they came by train. I can't even imagine what that would have been like for older people. But one thing that I just wanted to just kind of express a little bit of angst about is that, when I visited these places in Wyoming, Martin's Cove and the visitor center there, my ancestors' names are on the placard. And then my great grandmother's name is Ann Beswick, and she died along the trail in parentheses. And I've wanted to try to find out, and maybe someone in this group might know, if there's any markers or any way that you could ever find out where they were buried in this whole trek, this whole expedition. I haven't found it yet, but I certainly would love to. And also, during the sesquicentennial of the church, they put placards on a lot of these people's headstones that had, made the trek or had died along the trail. But my ancestor, she didn't get a placard, because she wasn't buried here in Utah. And so I've made it a point to make sure that she's recognized in one of the cemeteries where my great grandfather is buried, that, she died along the trail in the Martin Handcart Company. But anyway, tragedy, and my family is a part of it. So.
Great story. And yeah, if anyone knows that, I know from the places I've been, even at the Rocky Ridge, where they know 19 of them died and stuff, they don't know exactly where they died. So sometimes they'll put a marker that just has some people, but it had to be a pretty tragedy. I think the standard, one or two along the trail, I don't know that they know where those are, but if anyone knows, that'd be great to share with Melanie. Jeff.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, Rebecca mentioned all the deaths in the Willey and Martin Handcart Company. Even the earlier ones had higher death rates, if you look at the percentages, than was typical for the Overland Trail, which I thought was interesting. I have, on both my mother's side and my father's side, I have people in both of those companies. And just a little bit more color on the Denmark group. One of my ancestors was converted. Erastus Snow went to Aalborg, Denmark, converted 1,000 Danes, and essentially told them, Jesus is coming soon. We've all got to go to Zion. I mean, this is the motivation. And then they went to Liverpool, then Liverpool to New Orleans, up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and then crossed. And so to some extent, and another point is, after they all converted, they were harassed and persecuted by the Lutherans in Denmark. I mean, so they're basically, the Mormons created a problem for them and then gave them a solution, which is a very common thing. It's like, I'm going to create a problem for you, and then I'm going to give you the solution. The other thing that I don't think gets enough color, I mean, somebody mentioned the 11-year-old on the polygamous marriages. I'm descendant of William Clayton. And again, this was not the Willey and Martin Handcart Company, but Archer Walters was the father of my, I think, great to the fourth power grandmother, Sarah Walters. And she was 18 when William Clayton was 42. And if you don't have a problem with that, I think there's something wrong with you. And they ended up they had like 11 children, and she was his 8th wife. And so I think that, there's a lot of discussion I see about people denying polygamy. They should focus on people like William Clayton, Heber C. Kimball, where it's well documented that these guys were marrying teenagers when they're in their 40s and 50s, which I know that's not the focus of this discussion, but it's just, I think it's horrendous.
Yeah, appreciate that. And you brought up a good point where you said they were persecuted in Denmark. It was, as we read in the book, it was the same thing in England. The people really looked down on you if you were a Mormon. And the one gal's dad was told he had to quit his gardening job if he continued to be a Mormon. So, yeah, I think that happened in a lot of the countries. Joe.
Hey, folks, I'm driving. Let me pull over real quick. this to me is the perfect example of the danger of like faith-based or faith-driven decision making. I by almost every objective standard that I can see, there were a number of decision points along the way here where they should have known that this was a really bad idea to continue on that journey, including folks that among the party like that cautioned them, hey, this feels like a bad idea. Should we be doing this? And I think what happened is there was some amount of like, well, what else are we going to do? Urgency, but there was also a decent amount of God will provide if we show our faith and do what he asks us to do. And that to me is just tragic because for me personally, and you guys can probably do the same, is I look at decisions that I've made in my life that were mainly faith driven. A lot of them turned out to be really bad decisions. As I think about like me growing up, my dad made a zillion really poor financial decisions. And I can still remember him for many of those decisions saying, I know this doesn't make sense, but God will help us. God will provide. This is going to work out because we're showing faith to Heavenly Father by doing this decision. And the irony is that you would expect that if these decisions truly were inspired, right, by a divine source, you would expect better, not poorer decisions if they were truly inspired, right? But more often than not, faith-based decisions end up being worse, not better. Which, anyway, I'm an atheist. There may be faith-based people here. I'm not trying to discount faith in general. Only that it's clear that along this journey, at least, there should have been any number of objective cautions that they were making the wrong decision and allowed themselves to be overly influenced by faith, right?
Yeah, appreciate that, Joel. And as soon as Daniel's done, we're going to go look at that because that's the next thing is the decision to cross and how they made that decision and what were the factors in that. So appreciate that.
Yeah.
Daniel.
Yeah, we may talk about this more later on, but I just wanted to echo one of the things that you brought up that, and Brigham Young was like, I didn't know about the Martin and Willey handcart companies. And this is very much akin to the Mountain Meadows massacre. The Mormons are this great record-keeping people, and they have all these things. And Brigham Young was a consummate micromanager and knows everything and knows what everyone is doing. But then when something goes south, all of a sudden, they're like, well, no, we don't have any records of that. Like we don't have any information about that. I just think it's super interesting for everything that goes south. All of a sudden, there's a big hole in the records, and no evidence that Brigham Young knew about any of these things. I just thought that was a funny similarity between the Mountain Meadows and the handcart tragedy.
Yeah, and the author was pointed that out. One thing the author did a lot from Will Bagley. In fact, the book kind of comes from a paper that Will Bagley did. So that's important to keep in mind. Will Bagley, a lot of historians will say, oh, he was very antagonistic against the church. A lot of people say he had every right to be antagonistic against the church. Someone has to be. And so it's interesting. One thing to keep in mind and going along with what you talked about, Daniel, this is the Lion House and the Beehive House here in Salt Lake. And these were built in 1852 and 1854. And keep in mind that the handcart companies came across in 56, the first one. So he's already built these places. Brigham Young's estimated worth was $150,000 at this time, which is a multimillionaire back in the day. They're trying to save $13 and $93 with these people while he's amassing a fortune back in Utah. And that's just something that he pointed out and should be brought up, that while they're trying to do all these cost-saving measures, this is the opulence that Brigham Young is creating in Utah. So let's talk a little bit about the decision making, because by the time they got to Council Bluff in Iowa to winter quarters, they had a tough decision to make. It's already late August. They know even if they're figuring 70 days to get across, you just got to count on your fingers. August to September, September to October, October to November. You're in that October, November, if you go as fast as they say you could, which no one has done yet. you're going to be out in Wyoming in the Rocky Mountains in October, November, and you've got a strong chance that you're going to run into snow. You're going to run into cold. Even if it doesn't snow, it's going to get very cold. What I did here is I want to point the article here is what I pulled off of the LDS church site to say what happened on these decisions. On the right is what the book and some of the actual facts that just let you know that the church is really leaving out quite a bit of the story when they tell it. This is what the church says on their website. And one thing that we found when Tom, Rebecca, and I were up there was we went to 2 or 3 different visitor center, and every time they approached us, the first thing out of their mouth was, Brigham Young didn't know about this. He didn't know about the decision. They all voted and made the decision. It was all local leaders. The same thing we hear at Mountain Meadows. It was all local leaders that made the decision. And that may be true that the local leaders, had to make the decision. Brigham Young wasn't there in August when they were supposed to leave. But it's clear that the pressure was on them to get across. So here on the left, right above, this is a picture of Levi Savage. He's important in the Willey Handcart company because he stood up and actually said we shouldn't go, and we'll find out what happened to him. But this is what the book or the church website says. Leaders and immigrants held a meeting and voted to go on. If weather patterns had been normal, the decision would have been applauded. Instead, the decision has often been questioned. To say that if weather patterns had been normal, that's just completely, snows came in October, November all the time in this area. They still do. This was normal weather patterns. This was not anything out of the ordinary. It was worse than most snowstorms, granted that, but was not uncommon to have snowstorms and cold weather that time of year. Then they say Levi Savage, a sub-captain, was one who opposed the decision, but he said, seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, will die with you. The Willey Company left on August 16th. This is true. Levi Savage did say that. The problem is they don't tell you what Levi Savage said and what happened to him before he said that he would go on with them, which says more about Levi Savage and the honorable man that he was than how honorable the church leaders are. I took this right out of the book. It says, now, however, at the August 13th meeting, Savage arose and spoke. With tears streaming down his face, he pleaded against continuing the journey, the sole voice among the leaders to argue for wintering over in Florence. In his own journal, Savage recorded this courageous deed. Brother Willey exhorted the saints to go forward regardless of suffering, even to death. After he had spoken, he gave me the opportunity of speaking. I said to him that if I spoke, I must speak my mind, let it cut where it would. He said, certainly do so. I then related to the saints the hardships that we would have to endure. I said that we were liable to have to wade in snow up to our knees and should at night wrap ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. That was not like having a wagon that we could go into and wrap ourselves in as much as we liked and lie down. No, said I, we are without wagons, destitute of clothing, and could not carry it if we had it. We must go as we are. The handcart system I do not condemn. I think it is preferable to unbroken oxen and unexperienced teamsters. The lateness of the season was my only objection of leaving this point for the mountains at this time. I spoke warmly upon the subject, but spoke truth, and the people judging from appearance and after expressions felt the force of it. I want to stop right there and say a little bit about Savage. Savage had been, he had lost his wife. He left his son or daughter, he left a child to be raised by his sisters. He'd already been to Salt Lake. So he was one of the ones who'd already crossed the plains. He was then sent on a 4-year mission to England. He spent 4 years in England while his child was raised by a brother or a sister. After 4 years, he was finally allowed to come home, only under the condition that he would lead a wagon, a handcart company across the plains. And so he had experience. He'd been there and then he'd come back. He'd gone to England. So he's crossed the plains at least twice at this point. He knows what the weather's like in Wyoming. He knows what they're going to be facing, and he warns them. At this point, everyone was trying to sell this plan of Brigham Young to reduce the cost of crossings for these immigrants. And it was important that you support Brigham Young. This was his idea, and anyone who stands against his idea of these handcarts was basically considered an apostate. He even makes it clear, I'm okay with the idea of crossing in handcarts. My objection is that we're leaving this late. You're not going in a wagon. You have 17 pounds of clothes. Put this in perspective. I was in the military. When we would go out just for a couple days, we would carry about 70 pounds in a rucksack. You're carrying 17 pounds. If it rains, you don't have a coat heavy enough to keep the cold off of you. And this is the point he's trying to make. We don't have wagons we can get into when a downpour comes and stay dry. We're out there in the cold, in the wet with only 17 pounds, and we're going to be getting cold and we're going to suffer. And I don't recommend we go. And so he stood up for it. But if we go on, it says, for his pains, Savage was instantly rebuked by the other company leaders and church officials. Captain Willey was particularly scathing. As one immigrant later recalled, at the conclusion of his discourse, James G. Willey denounced him as a recreant to the cause of truth and a disturber of the peace of the brethren and an opposer of those who were placed over him and called upon him to repent. Heaping further scorn on Savage's misgiving, church official William Kimball now promised the saints. Now, William Kimball is Heber C. Kimball's son. He is a missionary who came back. Kimball, Grant, one other, and Richards, the mission president, are all at this meeting. They've all come back from England, and they're all weighing in. And William Kimball, Heber C. Kimball's son, said he promised the saints he would stuff into his mouth all the snow they would ever get to see on their journey to the valley. He never made good on that promise. And never suffered any ill effect. And this goes on to what Joel was talking about. It's easy to make a promise to people, claiming you have God on your side, but when it fails, there's no penalty. There's nothing there. So as a result of the leaders, this reminds me of when you stand up in Sunday school and say something's wrong with the history, and everyone all of a sudden someone jumps up and is very harsh on you and makes you sit back down and tries to defend the church. And that's exactly what happened. He got slapped down. And as a result, the saints voted to go on. And really, what choice did they have? They're in a foreign land. They have no jobs. They have, they could have tried to make it through the winter, but they really stuck in a bad position. And that's because they were told to go on from New York. They could have stayed in New York and earned some money and been more prepared. But the leaders are the ones who told them to go on. And the fact that Kimball and Richards are there is proof of that the leaders that David talked about saying they could get 10,000 people across, they're pushing and trying to make that happen. The Martin Company got together a couple days later. They arrived a little bit later than the Willey Company. The Willey Company left and the Martin Company came in. It says the Martin Company arrived in Florence after the Willey Company had left. After several meetings, the Martin Company decided to move ahead, leaving on August 25th. By September 2nd, 1856, the two independent wagon companies had also left Florence. So one thing most people don't realize is that there were wagon trains that were crossing with the handcart companies, and that was somewhat planned. But the wagons couldn't go as fast as the handcarts could, but they kept catching up with them because of all the problems the handcart companies were having. And when they got stuck at Devil's Gate, they actually had there were two wagon companies, but the wagon companies weren't carrying supplies for the handcart companies. And when you're talking 1,000 people, they're not going to give up their supplies. They'd run short themselves literally within a day or two, given that many. Elder Richards and several returning missionaries, including some who had helped outfit the handcart companies, were the last to leave. So they left a couple days after the Martin and Willey companies did. When they passed the Martin and Willey companies in early September 1856, they were surprised at the condition in which they found the Willey company due to reduced provisions, the condition of some carts, and the loss of 30 cattle in a stampede. They promised they would return with help. This is the church's version right here, and this is important. Look at that right there. They passed them and they were surprised at the condition after just a couple of weeks, how bad they were. The Willey company had a buffalo stampede, and of their 40 cows, 30 of them went off with the buffalo, and they could never be found. So they were down to just 10 cows when the missionaries find them. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens there. But let's look at what actually happened here. They don't say anything about Apostle Franklin Richards standing up and saying that they should go. Apostle Franklin Richards spoke at the meeting where they were voting. He said, and he's an apostle, "I hear that there are saints here who fear on account of the lateness of the season and may suffer in the crossing of the Rocky Mountains in snowstorms. This I will say as the saints have braved it thus far, and has anything come to hurt or mar the peace or safety of anyone? Therefore I prophesy in the name of Israel's God, through the storms we may come from the east, the west, the north, or the south. God will keep the way open to the faithful at heart and will arrive in the valleys in safety, and hope that the saints would be blessed with health and strength to pursue unto the journey's end, and there to meet the Lord's anointed and be saved with the just in the eternal world." So here an apostle gets up and promises you that the passes will be open all the way through and that you'll get there safely as part of the vote. So what do you think the vote's going to be when an apostle gets up and tells you that you're going to travel there safe? Now, keep in mind that just after this happens, he and the other missionaries get in a fast buggy with mules and make it across the plains in just a matter. They're home by October, while these guys are still out there in December or until the end of November. So he's not going with them. He's not pulling a handcart. He's going in a buggy. So this is the story that happens is this is the story that's told after they lose their cattle. Richards and Kimball and the others come up in their buggy, and this is what happens. It says these, and this is from Savage. He says, "These brethren, apostles Richard Kimball, told Captain Willey they wanted some fresh meat, and he had our fattest calf killed for them. I am ashamed for humanity's sake to say they took it. While we, 400 in number, traveling so slowly and so far from home with our mixed company of men, women, children, aged, sick, and infirm people, had no provisions to spare, had not enough for ourselves. In fact, these elders in Israel, these servants of God, took from us what we ourselves so greatly needed, and went on in style with their splendid outfit after preaching to us faith, patience, prayerfulness, and obedience to the Lord." Wow, these guys came. The apostle came. They'd lost 75% of the cattle that are supposed to sustain them. And they tell them, kill one of those for us so that we have food, so that we can eat in our fast buggy, and left these 575 people with one less cattle. They've now lost, what, 77, 78% of their food sources to feed an apostle so that they can travel home and not be hungry. Savage, as you can tell, is not very happy with this. But at the same time, and I don't know if no, I didn't put that. When they stopped, they took Savage to the side and they really gave him a scolding. They scolded him for his unfaithfulness. They right in front of everybody, the apostle pulled him out and said, "You caused dissension among the people. You leading the people away from obeying the leaders." And he just raked Savage over the coals because he had the fortitude to stand up and say, "I don't think we should go this late in the season." The only person who's really prophetic in this whole situation seems to be Savage, while the people who have the apostolic ability to prophesy are all the information they're providing ends up being wrong. So it's really quite a sad story. he also promised before he left that they would be resupplied at Fort Laramie. This is a map of where Fort Laramie is. It's once you cross out of Nebraska and into Wyoming, you hit Fort Laramie. This is what Fort Laramie, this is the remains of Fort Laramie, and this Fort Laramie today. It was a place that they could have decided to stay the winter once they got there. You know, where they'd have got the food for 1,000 people, that would have been difficult. So I think that they really made some people stayed behind, backouts, they called them. But the majority of them, you know, realized that they really had no option, and they went, they continued to go on through. I have not been to Fort Laramie. It's something I would like to go to. Any comments on the decision making? All right, I'm going to move on to the disaster. As I showed you right here, they got Fort Laramie. When they got to Fort Laramie, the supplies that were supposed to be there were not there. They had left no supplies for them. They realized at that point they were in a lot of trouble when they had no resupply. They'd lost most of their cows. But they could try to buy food, but they didn't have any money. They're poor. The prices were very high. I think the captain was able to get a little bit of, I can't remember what it was he got. He got something that lasted like a day or two, but that was it. So they head out, and they're heading, you know, they've got to try to make it the rest of the way. They start cutting their rations from 1,200 calories. They're down to like 3/4 of that, you know, 800 calories a day doing this kind of work. And they're just emaciated. They're starting to fall apart. And then they're just about to hit the hardest part. When we say Devil's Gate here is actually a rock formation. It really has nothing to do with the trail other than that is where the Martin Company was caught up. You can see here on the map where it says Martin Handcart Company Refuge Site. It's at Devil's Gate. There is a small fort there called Fort Seminole. Very poor repair, very small. We're going to show you some pictures of that. The Willey Handcart Company had already passed that area. They were about 100 miles ahead at a place called Sixth Crossing of the, I think it's the Sweetwater River that they were crossing. We got some pictures of that as well that we'll go into. But that's where the disaster strikes, is they're at those locations. This here's a picture of Sixth Crossing. It's absolutely a beautiful place when it's not snowing and cold and wet and all that stuff. This is the day we were there. It was in September, early September, and it was cold. The winds were blowing. It has not snowed yet, but you can see there's no campers at the campground there. This is actually the church has a church history site, or a visitor center there. We're driving along and there's this big log cabin in the middle of nowhere, and we're going, wow, someone built a big log cabin. And then we saw a sign that said Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Sixth Crossing Visitor Center. we had to pull in, and it was really interesting. Sixth Crossing's actually out. You can see where the river runs through there. This was where they could get good water because it would stay frozen almost all the year, so it stayed fresh. But it's kind of out a couple miles is where actually Sixth Crossing is. We got in my truck, and no one was there in September. We were like the only people there, and the missionary was really bored. And we said, hey, we want to drive out there. So he hopped in the truck, and we drove out there. My truck was covered in mud by the time we got back because it's not a dirt road. It's just a dirt road to get out there. But this is where they were caught. Right here is the actual site. They were just on the other side of this river. We caught these deer were there. It's just a gorgeous site. But you see, there's no shelter. Those little bramble trees is what they backed up to, and they were trying to stay in there to get shelter from the wind and the snow. And that's where they camped, was right. So if you look at the picture on the right there with the open prairie, that's taken right with our back up against those trees. This is the site that when the relief column finally made it to them. And if you remember in the book that Willey had to go out for 3 days and try to find them because they were all camped as well. The supply trains had stopped because they couldn't move either. And when they finally found, when Willey said, I've got the people, they moved to get there, and it took them a couple days. This is the site. They were looking out this direction when they saw the first wagons come across in that cold area. Yeah, Brianna.
I just wanted to say something. I had kind of made some mention of this in the comments earlier, but this is where I live, and I just wanted to confirm those trees are so out of place for the whole state of Wyoming. I mean, they were so lucky that they had those right there at the right time, because the rest of our state, we don't have trees. And this whole story just gets me so upset, just the way that it happened. I mean, my state is just, it's for the toughest people. Even in the summertime, I mean, it snows in Wyoming in August. And yeah, I don't know, I just get really incensed. It really hurts my sensibilities that I should have commented this earlier, but to have someone experienced as Levi Savage, who had been there multiple times, and he's telling them exactly, like, I know what it looks like. This is not a good idea. And not only did they not listen to him, they shamed him. Yep, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, appreciate it. And this state is gorgeous, but there's a reason that less than 1 million people live there.
Well, you're so kind. There's a couple places that are gorgeous. Maybe this is one of them, but I wouldn't say that for the whole state.
We went, and the whole time I was driving through, I was going, it's beautiful in a completely different way. It's just so open, the skies, it was raining, but that wind, when you got out of the car, it was rough when you'd get out of the car. And this is just September.
Yeah, that wind tore up our trampoline one year. It's insane.
Yeah, it is rough. This is where the Martin Handcart Company was. This is Devil's Gate, Martin's Cove area. To tell you how cold it was, we didn't walk to Martin Cove because it was too cold. It was 3-mile walk there and back, and the wind was blowing at like 70 miles. I don't know, 70. It was clearly 40 or so. You can see the flag there is at full staff. But this was Fort Seminole. So when they got caught, there was this small fort that was manned by 1 or 2 people. There was only 1 missionary there when we went. We were the only people there. But this is when they got there. Remember, they started unloading the baggage so that they could start hauling people in the wagons. So the wagons that were there, the 2 wagon trains that were there, they were freighters. A lot of them were freighters. There were immigrants in there too, but freighters was one of the things that they were doing. Brigham Young had a steam engine being brought over so he could build a ship, and also liquor coming and something. So they unloaded these the wagons at this fort. It took them 3 days to do that, and then they had to abandon the hand carts at this point, and they put them in wagons and tried to transport them the rest of the way. But you're sitting there and you're going, there's a shelter right here, but there's 1,000 people. You can't put 1,000 people in this fort. They're tearing it apart, trying to get anything they could to burn to stay warm. But this fort was really quite interesting. Here we are at the fort. And this is a replica of the fort. The actual fort, there is a footprint where you can see where the fort was. This is a replica that the church has bought. This is what the replica looks like on the inside. Cozy little place, but little. You can see it's got pretty much 1 room. This is the place where the 14 guys had to stay, where everyone else left, and tried to survive, and had to eat the pelts and everything like that just to survive. They have an example of where they had kind of, it looked like almost like warehouses, and they'd open up these doors and they could stack all of the goods, and that's where they put the freight. You can see up in that upper right hand corner is kind of a picture of what the stacking would have looked like of the freight. And then they closed those, and that's what they were guarding when they left. And if you remember the story, some of the apostates left Salt Lake the next year, and they came back to the fort to try to get their stuff, and they wouldn't give it to them. And they had that kind of standoff, and the apostates eventually gave up because trying to attack a fort was too much to try. This is the inside. They kind of had like a little trading post thing there, but again, just with thousands of people, and 1,000 people is just the Martin Handcart Company. Then you have the 2 wagon trains stuck there too. So you're literally talking 1,300 people trying to stay warm in this one area. There's our captain there in there, and just this is Devil's Gate. This is 2 different pictures. One's got the handcarts in it, and but it's an amazing looking thing. It doesn't play into the story at all. It's just a landmark where Martin Cove is, but you can see it's quite an impressive site, and we want to set up a field trip to go up here, but we didn't want to do it in February or March, so it'll probably be in a month or two. We'll set something up, and anyone who'd like to go, we'll stop at Sixth Crossing, we'll stop at Martin's Cove, and some of the other sites along the way. This is to show you how cold it was. Rebecca had her hat on, and that wouldn't keep her cold, so she had to take her gloves and shove them up her hat just to keep her ears warm. That's how cold it was. And then the wind blew the glove, and I think Tom had to chase it a quarter of a mile to get the glove that blew out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that picture, Landon. That was one of my proud. Thank you. Yeah,
anytime.
Thank you so much. It's a new look. You shove the gloves in the hat, the ears are covered. I'm telling you, it works.
This must be what they look like, anything to try to stay warm. And I would say, it was above freezing, but with the wind chill, it was probably below freezing. It was -11 at the Cove when they were there, with the wind blowing on top of that, if you can just imagine how difficult that was. So let's talk a little bit about the rescue. Obviously, they're stuck. They don't know what to do. They're on the plains. They have no wood. They have no food. They can't move. Their tents are blowing over. All they're doing is trying to survive. They're just hunkering down, trying to stay out of the wind and trying to stay warm enough not to freeze to death. We know that the Willey company got found first. There's the trapper. I can't remember his name, but he came into the camp and said, "Hey, there's a train behind me," and that's when Willey and one of his captains got on and went and looking for him, and it took him several days to find them and finally get it there. They went on trying to find the Martin Handcart Company, because the Willey company said, "No, the Martin company's behind us." They went looking for them. It took several days again to find that train, and then when they finally got there, none of them really had any supplies with them. They just had enough to keep them alive. So they gave what food they could, but the majority of the survivors, or the majority of the people who died after they'd met the rescue train. So the rescuers had found them, but they still didn't have any supplies. The wagons carrying the supplies were so far behind them, and they had dropped supplies along the way, and so the supplies weren't all with the wagons. The wagons only had limited amounts of supplies. So at this point, all the handcarts were abandoned. The people were put into wagons, and they tried to make it there. And when we hear about the rescue, we always think about Brigham Young. This is Brigham Young telling him to go out and rescue him. This is one of the famous speeches from Brigham Young, and you can read this if you'd like, but I think the famous line is, "I will tell you all that your faith, religion, and profession of religion will never save one soul of you in the celestial kingdom of our God, unless you carry out just such principles as I am now teaching you. Go and bring in those people now on the plains." We all heard that story of him stopping General Conference and sending everybody out to get the people. The interesting part was he said, "Oh, me and Brother Heber will go and get them. If you won't get them, we'll go get them. Let's take a vote. If we should leave you and go and get the people," and the people all go, no, we'll go get them. You need to stay here, prophet. We'll go get them. He knew that they would all go, that he wasn't going to have to go get them. In fact, he sends out the rescue parties to go and start finding these people. And we know from letters that he knew they were out there. He said he didn't know they were out there. But he starts giving them, he tells them exactly what to take. You can see what a micromanager he is. He tells them how many 12 tons of flour, 40 teamsters, drive the teams here. He knew exactly what he wanted them to do and where they should go and where they should take it. And it was really the people who gathered this all together and took off and started looking for these people. One interesting part in the book was when they did finally get to the valley, they did get charged for the supplies that were brought out to them. They had to pay for the flour and stuff that got brought out to them after they arrived in Salt Lake. The other story that was interesting to me was that Brigham Young went to meet them, supposedly was going to go to Fort Bridger and meet them, and he got like one day out of town, got violently sick. Then he got healed miraculously, but they decided they better go back to Salt Lake. The next day they go back to Salt Lake, and Brigham Young never made it there. Just seemed kind of interesting that Brigham Young made, I'm going to go see him, and yet he never actually made it out to these. To him, this was a failure of his plan. He had, he was counting on these handcarts to reduce the cost. He made the financial decision to put these people on the planes in these reduced conditions, and he was embarrassed by it. And the church, it showed that the church, for years, they didn't talk about this. It wasn't a faith promoting experience. It was an embarrassment to the church that they put the people in this position and that they couldn't save them. And so for years, who was to blame came up, and there's several people in here. Franklin Richards is the person who really took the brunt of the blame. Brigham Young wouldn't talk to him for years, saying it was his fault for encouraging them to leave when he did. But you got to imagine that Brigham Young was giving the instructions to get him here as fast as he could. Brigham Young, we know, knew about it. We know that there were supply trains set out earlier in that were supposed to get to Laramie. The book talked about how they just disappeared. I didn't quite get that story as to, no one knew what happened. They went and they never showed up. And nobody knows why or where. Up in the right-hand corner, that's Willey, the guy that led the captain of the Willey Handcart Company. The lower left there is Martin, the Martin who led the Martin Handcart Company. The people who took the most blame for it was the immigrants themselves. The church leaders blamed them for making the decision to leave. They should have never left. That was against all of Brigham Young's instructions, although no one can find any instructions where Brigham Young ever said don't leave by a certain time or stay. It was often as they would die, they would be blamed for, well, the ones that died were the ones that lacked the faith to get to Zion. They would be blamed on their own for it. And even in conferences, the leaders would blame the people for poor decision making is what led to it. Okay, I want to go just here and then we'll turn it over and let everyone do their comments. But
Can I ask one question, Landon, really quickly? I know a lot of people have heard that the rescue effort was more for the steam engine and the alcohol. Is there any truth to that? Just the idea that, the people were like, yeah, they're out there, but we really need to bring the goods back. And if some people get rescued along the way, that's okay too.
So one of the things they talk about is the second rescue that happened years later, where the stake president had this premonition that, we need to get all the names and have their temple work done, and they did all the temple work for him, and it was called the second rescue. Well, there was a second rescue, but the second rescue was he sent one team out to save the people. He sent another rescue group out to get his steam engine and his alcohol. I could never determine where that was. I think it made it through. It was on an earlier train. but he told them if they needed to divert people from the rescue mission to the Martin Hand Company to go and help to bring his still and his steam engine back. And so there is truth to that. I just couldn't tell to what level how many people got diverted and if it hurt the rescue. And when they did get diverted, I believe it was before they knew before the storms happened and everything. They knew there were people still out on the plains, but they weren't caught up in the snowstorm yet. So I think there's some truth to that. I just couldn't tell how bad it was, and David might know a little bit more about that, but that I couldn't tell from that.
Right, but he definitely cared about it. At the same time the people were out, he cared about, oh, and my goods are there too. So
he was a multimillionaire for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
He was about business. In fact, his biggest complaints about John Taylor, he always was on John Taylor. He hated John Taylor, and his complaint was, he's a horrible businessman. He doesn't know how to make any money. He can't make any enterprise work. Well, he's an apostle. He's not supposed to be a businessman, but that was Brigham Young's biggest complaint against John Taylor, was that he was a horrible businessman, and couldn't ever make a profit for anything. But when you look at this, the church has turned this whole handcart thing. We all been asked to go on trek. I don't know, maybe they don't do trek in the UK, David. That's probably a little harder, but we've all been asked to go on trek in our wards and to go and experience this. But it's almost makes a mockery of what these people went through, because they were forced to do this. I think someone said that there was one ward that had Cafe Rio cater their trek thing. These people are starving. They're eating, flour on the thing. And this is kind of it's a rite of passage in the Mormon church now, is that, these people showed so much faith that they followed the prophet, even when it meant sure death. They were martyrs for the cause. And they did show a lot of faith. These people were incredible. As I read the stories, I just, it just broke your heart that these people were so destitute and so wanting to get somewhere to have a better life. You just, and there were stories from here, you read about them getting whipped and stuff as they went across, that they'd actually whip the children and they'd whip the people, which sounds cruel. I would say one criticism I had as I was reading the book is the guy did criticize them a lot for some of the tactics they used to keep the people moving. I don't know that this guy ever has been in a situation where he has to make people do something in a very difficult situation. When I was in the military, I mean, these are the tactics you use to get people when they fall down and they can't go any further. Is you start telling them, you're weak, you get up, you're not going to take down the whole troop, you're going to help. And that's how you move people. Sometimes you had to, that's why drill sergeants get in your face and yell at you. They're trying to get you motivated and keep you moving. And there was a story in here about a young boy who was trying to keep up with the wagon so that he didn't have to keep walking, and it was freezing and the snow was coming down. He ran up to the wagon, and all the other kids fell back. They couldn't keep up, but he kept running in hopes that he'd get asked to get on the wagon. And the wagon master saw him and said, "You want to ride?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Come on, run up here." And so he started running, and the wagon master just kept the wagon going, and he couldn't catch up. And he said, "I hated that guy." And then finally the wagon master stopped, and he took him and he put him in a blanket and he put him in the wagon. And the boy realized years later that what he was doing was he was making him run so that he wouldn't freeze to death when he put him in the wagon. And when you think about that, that sounds cruel, but these people, they were survivors. That's what they were. They were tough. I couldn't survive this minus 11 degrees out in Wyoming in the winter for days on end with no food. Just incredible. So they're right to promote the people and how strong they were and how much they went through, but to promote this as, the leaders led us through it. The leaders, they followed the prophets. They did what they were told, and God blessed them. That's not reality. They were there because they did what the leaders told them, and that's what happened. And the church was embarrassed by it for years. And then they do what they always do. They spun it into a triumph and great leadership and foresight by Brigham Young to do it. David, yeah.
I was going to say that in the mid 1850s, the church, or under Brigham Young, lost about $150,000 in the different enterprises. So whether it was sugar or pottery or building or whatever. And the way that you get people behind you is to tell people about their burdens, why they're so miserable, and then you blame another group of people. And Brigham Young for years blamed the very poorest of people for not having repaid the money. And that's why the people in the valley were so poor, because those immigrants had not paid their way. So despite the fact that Brigham Young had his, well in excess of $150,000, a millionaire status, he still blamed the very poor that came through as immigrants because they defaulted. And that to me is almost unforgivable.
Yeah, appreciate that. That was one of the things, the sad parts to me was it was that the church, it was how much the church didn't do for the immigrants after all that they went through. But I will say the institutional church didn't do. The people in the valley, when they got there, they welcomed them, they took care of them, they housed them. It's impressive when you look at how people were willing to share. They were willing to share everything they had to help each other as the people, but the church was always enriching itself. It just seems like that is something that went on and on. The church and the leaders always seem to be enriching themselves at the cost of the members. But that should in no way take away from the incredible fortitude of these people in making these crossings and what they built here in Utah out of a desert of nothing. It's impressive what people can do when they work together, and they did it. So I don't want to take anything away from that, because it's definitely an impressive thing. So with that, just turn over to anyone who wants to make a comment or anything on the book that they wanted to comment on. Well, if there's nothing, then Rebecca will.
Good discussion.
Jeff had something.
I think we're just stunned. I think there's a lot of emotions in talking about this book. Oh, I think Jeffrey has a comment. Yes.
Yeah, just one comment. I'm struck. I mean, this is an issue that I've had with my family, because my family on both sides goes back, as I mentioned, 6 generations in the church. The way the journals are mostly skewed to the positive. So we don't really know what people thought. I mean, it was interesting that Patience Loader in the book, there's a few things here and there. As you know, since I'm descended of William Clayton, I have George A. Smith's signature books that's got his diaries. But I understand that's only about 25% of all the William Clayton diaries. And the church announced in 2017 that they were going to release those, and we're now 7 years later. It's not clear when they're going to. That's one of the few places where you're going to get all the information. But I think that's just a general problem, particularly, and I find it so contradictory, because I was always told growing up, write in your journal. My mom used to make us write in our journal every Sunday, which we hated doing as children. But that and then for the places that matter, we just hardly have any information that's actually reasonably objective. It's just, it's interesting when you go through some of these discussions. And then as a consequence, we can mythologize the past. That's what allows, it allows the current leadership to mythologize the past as a consequence, which I think is problematic.
Yeah, and they did burn a lot of, or we don't know if they burned, but a lot of the journals are missing. Martin kept a journal all the way across, and we don't have his journal, and no one's quite sure what happened to it. So that's a good point. Jackie and Luann had some comments too, it looks like. So
okay, so I had a lot that really came across with this. Growing up my whole life, we went north to Wyoming up by Cody, we were always going through South Pass City and South Pass and stopping where the Mormon Trail diverged from the Oregon Trail. So I'd always seen all of that area and thought how desolate and like lonely it is. And then we stopped with the kids a few years ago, and my mother-in-law, and actually at the museum, I didn't even know it had existed at the Martin at the Cove, and had been there, and the kids had pulled the hand carts and everything. And I didn't even know all that existed. And it was we learned about the hand carts in my era growing up, but not that much, you know, just that they came across and, oh, wasn't that wonderful that they had so much faith to do that, and it was bad. But I kind of liked the take that he wanted to know why, who was to blame for this horrible tragedy. And he could never like really pinpoint that. And even like going to the visitor center where he describes the dominoes that he saw, like how the church just takes things and they just put it into the most easily digestible facts. So there's no critical thinking about it, right? So here's the domino, first one falls, and then it just all of these. But what causes the first domino, and I mean, it's just, there's no critical thinking. And then when he's there and he's talking to those women from the West Valley area, which is where I'm from, so that hit me again. And he's like, well, what did he say to them? He's like, you know, he tells them that story about crossing the Sweetwater is a myth. And then they're like, well, how do you know that it didn't happen? And then one woman goes, well, we could pray. And that's just like, yeah, that's not how you get truth, right? You don't pray, but that's what the church, that's what they tell us to do. That's what we were told to do about the Book of Mormon. Pray and you will know it was true. So he's getting these snippets of just what we're not given any critical thinking skills as Latter-day Saints. And I'm seeing this in this book, and I'm an historian. My degree's in history, and I'm just like totally enthralled by this whole book. And then when he goes to the other woman and he says to her, he asked her at that other smaller visitor center, who's to blame? And he goes, yeah, after all, more than 200 people died. And she's like, they came to know God, and not one of them ever left the church. Well, we know that's a lie, right? I mean, so we have this whole mythology. So I had written down today when we were starting, I was like, and I think Landon, were saying this, but I was like, it was a tragedy turned to a triumph to protect Brigham Young and create a faith promotion. And that's just what they do over and over again in Mormonism, is just all these faith promoting rumors. And it just seems like the Willey and Martin handcart companies became a big faith promoting rumor, and nobody's really cared about the real lives that were behind it. And that's kind of bothered me, this whole thing. And yeah,
it was really interesting because the author was he's not a member of the church. He's never been a member. And it was interesting to kind of read his take on how nobody seemed to care.
Yeah, nobody cared
if the facts were right or not, as long as they were useful.
Yeah, as long as they got kids out on trek. And I never went on trek. I don't know if that was a thing we did back in the 70s when I was in. I don't think we did it then.
It started kind of in the 80s. You had to kind of line up, and then they took that and made it go to all the wards started doing it later, probably in the 90s for that.
Yeah. So our daughter went. Our son didn't go, but our daughter went. She's not really all that impressed. I never went on trek, and so, but it just is, and it's just another thing yet to faith promoting rumor, right? It's a big faith promoting rumor. That's what it is. It's not. There's no truth behind it. They don't treat even the carts they use aren't correct. Even the ones at the museum aren't correct. I mean, and so it's just. It was just more infuriating of the lies that the church promotes, and that they blame the members to protect themselves. Anyway,
Thank
it was
you.
good.
Luann?
Mine is just a little more specific. She touched on it, that the faith promoting story of the man who defends criticisms of the decisions and says that he would decide how far he could push the cart. And when he reached that point, he would need to look behind him to see who had started pushing the cart. And that 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 was where he became to know God. Was that story covered in the book?
I believe that was. I seem to remember that he talked about people, and I don't think it was just one person. I think there were several who would say, "Oh, when we couldn't push any further, there was help pushing it," which is always.
We have a slide, Landon. Maybe back up and show that picture. We do
Yeah.
to further promote this narrative. A lot of things that are used are visuals. Pictures. I think it's one back where the angels
I'm
you
not
can't go back.
anymore, so,
Okay.
but yeah,
If you watch it again, there is a painting where, they're beleaguered, they're pushing, but then there are angels also pushing with them. So that narrative is definitely pushed.
And evidently those stories were started, as someone said in the chat, after all of the real people had died.
Yeah. And that's common for people who go through something very difficult, that they don't think that they can do it on their own, that they think that someone else is helping. But it's certainly not common to the LDS Church. There's people everywhere who have had problems or who have felt that their God or their ancestor or someone else was helping them, and it's an explanation for why something happened that they thought they couldn't do themselves, or that pushed them. So, Melanie.
You're muted, Melanie.
There you go. Oh, you're back muted again. You're still muted, Mel. There
Okay,
you go.
am I okay?
Good.
I just am curious from this group how you all feel about how the church has made all this big exhibit. All these little visitor centers, how they probably bought up all this land in Wyoming, and they've done these tributes or these. I'm curious. I resent it. I have been there because of curiosity, but even when I go there, it just feels like it's just this miraculous thing that the church wants everybody to feel and to witness and to get this spiritual experience when they go there. And to me, it's not a spiritual experience at all. It's a tragedy. And here the church has poured millions of dollars, I'm sure, in these monuments.
It would be like the Jewish people taking Auschwitz or Dachau and making it a missionary tool. Of course, when you walk someone through this horrific, hundreds of people dying and suffering, people are going to feel something, and they're going to feel, oh my gosh, and they're going to be impressed with the people who survived and the human story. And the church has learned they can manipulate that. They can use that to make you feel that that's, God got these people through. It's amazing God got them through. Then why didn't God not put them in the situation in the first place? He gets all the credit for saving, but not for the issue in the first place. The apostle promised them that God wouldn't make it snow, but he made it snow.
Did God really save these people?
Yeah.
Well, I think
exactly. Well, ask
I
yourself
think that's one of the major differences.
Oh, go ahead,
I
Daniel.
was going to say between Dachau and this is that the Jewish people didn't do that to themselves. It wasn't the Jewish leaders that caused that. And I think that's part of why it's so repugnant is the Mormon leaders caused these problems through their bad planning and trying to scrimp and save and pushing people and false promises that God would protect them. They did this. And now they're lying about it and being like, look how great we are. And this is, our people are so faithful. Look at all this. And that's to me what's the most repugnant about it is they put them in this position, they cause the suffering, and then they turn around and act like it's a great thing for them. That just seems gross.
The church is always about sacrificing. That's how they want you to live your life, is just to sacrifice everything. And so I feel like this is a tribute to those that sacrificed, but all of these people didn't need this sacrifice.
Yeah, I don't even see a problem with asking people to sacrifice if the institution itself is willing to sacrifice and live the same thing they're asking the people to do. But that's not the case. They're profiting off of the sacrifices of other people. That to me is the sickening point. Jeff?
Yeah, just responding to that. One of the things that I find super irritating is, on the one hand, the active members will tell you that the gospel is unchanging. And here you have a situation where clearly the narrative has changed. And what I mean is, a lot of these people who are coming, and my ancestors among them, they were told that they had to gather to Zion. That was part of the doctrine. And once they got there, they had to practice plural marriage. That was part of the doctrine. Today, and I asked my brother the other day about this, neither of those things, as far as I can tell, are part of the doctrine. I think the church actually explicitly says to people, don't move to Utah. I think half of my ward in California I grew up in has moved to Highland, and to Alpine. And they're just boosting real estate prices. And I think they partially think there's some kind of thing about gathering to Zion. So it's this weird thing where, on the one hand, you're telling me the doctrines never change, and then in fact, I challenged my brother one time, give me one doctrine that hasn't changed since 1830. And he came up with one: baptism by immersion. So that was it. But everything else, and it's incredible that then it gets morphed into something that's just completely detached from what was actually going on. Because if you're sitting there living in Europe and England or Denmark or what have you, the other thing is, there was a small group of saints in St. Louis. Now, I know Missouri was not the greatest place for the Mormons, but there was some, as far as I know, there's some debate, like, maybe we should just hang out here. Why do we have to go across the plains? And that whole piece of the discussion is just erased, which I think is again, it's a problem if you're trying to understand the motivation and the history.
Yeah, and as you said, they were gathering, and why were they gathering? Because the second coming was imminent, and you had to be there in order to be saved. That's what they're telling them. You got to come here to be saved, because this is where you're going to be saved, is in Zion. And no one talks about, well, Jesus never showed up.
He's coming April 8th. So they were just a little late. We have less than a month. So everybody get ready. It is happening.
And sorry, one other thing I was just thinking, I grew up in San Francisco and the East Bay in California in the 80s, and we never did Trek. I don't really and then after that, when we were active, we were living in Tokyo and San Francisco, so our kids were not in normal wards. But I don't, this whole Trek thing just kind of came out of the blue. So I don't really understand, like, who started it or why it started. In the 80s, we did lots of other stuff, like a road show and dance festival and plays. And I think I was going to church like every day. It was crazy.
Yeah, I was in a pilot program at BYU in the early 70s that was called Wilderness. And it was kind of the first attempts at doing kind of this outward bound thing and stuff. And that was like 1973 or 74. Yeah, Trek was long after I became an adult.
Yeah, when I was there in the 80s, like my sister went, but it was like an EFY. You had to sign up through BYU to do it. And so they did that for several years, and then the stakes started picking it up and saying, oh, we've got to have this experience, and they just built on it and built on it. And then they made it, and every 4 year your stake is supposed to go on. At least here in Utah, every 4 years you're supposed to do Trek.
Well, and now they have Book of Mormon Trek. I don't know if you guys have been following this trend. It's going to get bigger and bigger, where the kids dress not like pioneers, but like Book of Mormon characters. And they go out and they have different little reenactments of events in the Book of Mormon. The video I saw of one of them, they have a man dressed like Jesus that walks among everybody. And it sounds funny, but it was very disturbing, because some of these kids, very vulnerable, got very attached to this person. It showed them just hugging. Is very wrong, very wrong. I've seen this so far only in Utah, as you said, the Highland Alpine area. What is wrong with this? I have no idea. But yeah, extremely disturbing. It's another kind of a trek, but it's all based on Book of Mormon. They would do the final battle only with chalk. So half of you are Lamanites, half of you are Nephites, and you're throwing chalk again. Maybe we need to do an
Oh,
episode on
that's
this one
not
then.
cultish or anything.
Oh, no. That was very exactly. No, with that
Do the
Jesus
Nephites-
walking around and throwing chalk and how do we know how they even dressed anyway, right?
Yeah, that's my question. Were the Nephites dressed up like Viking warriors?
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, yeah. Of course. Everybody was a Viking. Everybody. Yeah.
And do the
Absolutely.
Nephites lose?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's a predetermined outcome if they understand what the Book of Mormon is. So I'm not quite sure how they did that, but they recreated Samuel on the wall in the little promo video I saw where they had, and again, these are characters, people from the stake dressing up like the major, the prophets and things and coming in to manipulate these kids and give them this experience. So, yeah.
Well,
Can't say
Jackie's
enough
got a
about
comment.
that.
Let's go to Jackie and then
Yeah.
we'll end and then we can talk amongst ourselves.
Oh my gosh, I'm just blown away by what Rebecca was just talking about.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I totally lost my train of thought almost.
I'm sorry.
I'm just, whoa. Okay. So I just kind of like, I was hit by the thought that the author put out that Brigham Young really didn't care much about human life anyway. That and he said that I do this a lot when I'm in a book club. He likes that we would regard today as an undervaluing of human life. And I think that's why he went through the whole blood atonement thing and everything at the beginning, because he said that apostates who wanted to flee Zion were better off dead, sincerely believed that it was preferable for a saint to die on the handcart trail than to languish in Babylon. And like all despots, Young found himself virtually incapable of admitting that he was wrong or had committed a mistake. He never acknowledged the handcart disaster for the tragedy it was. And I think that pretty much sums it up for me, is that if the top doesn't accept their responsibility, then a whole history can be rewritten about it. And that's what's happened, I think, pretty much. That was my take on it. And it makes me I'm just absolutely disgusted that we never learned we don't learn the real history, but they can't hide it from us anymore. So that's good.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent comment. Thank you. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why is everyone so upset or concerned that the church has now purchased all the sites, the Kirtland Temple and all of that? And it's because of the narrative. It's because they purchased the narrative and they're going to do to that exactly what they've done to the Willey Martin handcart, to any of it. And, only those of us that dig deep, that try hard, that keep fighting the fight, we have to preserve that narrative. So I think it's important. So let's say, Landon.
Was Lori trying to
go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Can I say a couple things?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm new to this kind of thing. I just FYI, we were in the Reed company, my ancestors, and they came over there from East London. So they were in the not the Reed, the Martin company, and their last name was Reed. That's why I said that. In any ways, the interesting thing, and the thing that I agree with so many of what people have said, is that I wish I knew the truth, because the journals or the books that have been written, even the biographies, etc., are just whitewashed. And with common sense that everything wasn't hunky-dory. But what's interesting in my case, and I'll tie this into Women's History Month, is my great-great-great-grandmother was Thisbe Reed, but she ended up marrying Ephraim Hanks, who was one of the guy that went off solo to help the party. And he was 11 when she met him. Her mother and her sister were there, but actually her father had said goodbye early on in the trek. He went back east. He was still, I'm not into this. So at any rate, so Ephraim Hanks went on to marry, luckily she was at least 17, Thisbe when she was 17 and he was 36, I believe, which, and the third wife, which, okay, whatever. But what I find frustrating is that when we talk about all these things, we don't mention the women. There's been movies made about Ephraim Hanks, whether you believe them or not, because nobody's that perfect, And but what about Thisbe? What about her mother? that also her sister also trekked, and she went on to have 10 children with Ephraim Hanks, and live in what's now Capitol Reef. And it's just so frustrating that the women that shared in these hardships are not highlighted, but it's the men's voices that, so and so said this, Levi said that. Well, that's great. But what did the women say? And I just want to speak up for her, because you're right. I think it's all whitewashed. Common sense tells you this was not a walk in the park, and it wasn't a faith journey. It was hell, and that's how I feel. I think I'm in agreement. I do agree with a lot of I'm not Mormon anymore. Yet I live in Utah, and I ask myself, well, why? So something fascinates me, but I just wish more voices of the women and the pioneer women, and in my case, this woman, I wish I knew her truth. I'm tired of, no disparaging remarks about Ephraim Hanks or the other scouts, but let's hear if we could find out somehow the real journals.
Yeah.
That was so interesting to me.
One,
And
one of my,
we owe it to them. Look hard.
one of my favorite stories was the one of the mother who the kids wouldn't get up because they were all freezing to death, and she asked them to get up to give them to bake, to start a fire, and none of them would get up. So she got up and started dancing for them, and then she fell over and they all jumped out of and I just went, that's so a mom right there. Every one of us can appreciate that. And she fell down on purpose because she knew that the kids would get up to come help her if she did it, and just played the kids perfectly. So it's like, that's a mom there. So
yeah, I just think, I'm furious to how whitewashed everything is. I mean, you don't do anyone justice when you whitewash their story, their tragedy, their emotions, their physical labor. I mean, come on, who does that? Well, we know who does it, but anyway, thank you.
No, those are great comments. I appreciate that. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the women's voices were silenced back in the day, are silenced now. We can do what we can to try to recover. And that is really important, because they were a major part of everything that happened. So first, let's say, Landon, that was fabulous. Absolutely amazing. I'm not kidding. Boy, you put so much time into this, and the slides were amazing, and you really took us on the journey. So that was amazing. Thank you so much. That was incredible. Wonderful presentation. That
we'll
was
get
great.
something planned so that others can go out and see this if they haven't.
Yeah, no, and we are talking about this field trip, which would just be whichever of you want to come drive along with us, and we'll find, hotels to stay in, and we'll just kind of do it when it's a little bit warmer, so I don't have to wear my gloves and my hat. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, moving on to next month. This is going to be our book for April. It is Sunday the 14th. And our leader of the discussion is going to be Bruce Christensen, Guns, Germs, and Steel. We'll have Bruce take just a minute or so and tell us what kind of a treat we are in for. Okay, Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond. I read this when it came out. It's, over 20 years old, but it talks about explores the reasons behind unequal distribution of wealth, power around the world. Diamond argues that environmental factors such as the availability of domesticable plants, animals, geographical features, and the development of technology played a crucial role in shaping the course of human history. Overall, Guns, Germs, and Steel provides a thought-provoking analysis of the factors and influences that have influenced the rise and fall of civilizations, shedding light on the complex interplay between geography, culture, technology, and shaping the world we live in today. And with many of our books, we've read Sapiens, Who We Are and How We Got Here. We were raised with a narrative, and I found this book helps describe how the world kind of really works, and not the narrative that we were raised with. And I think that as time goes by and science advances, we even learn more than what was presented in this book. So it's a great book if you can read it. If not, just come for the discussion, because it's a really good
discussion.
Thank you, Bruce. And yeah, that's the secret of book club. We try to read the books. We want everybody to read the books, but if you can't, just come and participate in the discussion. Everything is through the lens of Mormonism, and so you will be able to make a valuable contribution just because of that. So let's very quickly run through the rest of our slides, and then we'll move to our mix and mingle. So if you are new to the book club and you'd like to catch up on past episodes, you can go to YouTube and search the Good Book Club for Post Mormons, and everything's recorded. You can catch up there. It's really fun. Let's see what else. Media on the Radar. That's a Facebook page that you can join where we just curate other media, documentaries, films, shows, things like that, plays that are on the radar in the post-Mormon world or the nuanced Mormon world or the Mormon world. You can also check out Mormonish podcasts. Landon and I do that. We do 2 episodes a week on Tuesday night live and then on Friday night. And we cover a lot of things that we talk in book club. In fact, we are going to do an episode now that we have these fantastic slides. We're going to have to recreate it. And I think we'll put it out on Mormonish too with a little more discussion. So check that out if you'd like. If you'd like to be a member of the book club and you're not yet, you can contact me at thegoodbookclub@mail.com. You can also find us on Facebook. That's our little logo right there. And that's kind of the place where we talk throughout the month about the book and put information. You can also find us on Instagram. Just connect with us. We'd love to have you join. We have a lot of fun here and learn a lot and process a lot. If you do send me an email to thegoodbookclub@mail.com, it sometimes goes to spam when I reply. So make sure that you check there because I will always reply. And I think that is our ending point. Thank you, everybody.